One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, everybody. It's Dr. Noseworthy again, and we're back with the Inflammation Nation. Before we continue on in our hormone series, let me just deal with a couple of administrative things. If you have been listening, but you haven't subscribed or Hey there, everybody. It's Dr. Noseworthy. We're back with the Inflammation Nation talking about health and hormones. We'll continue on here in a moment, but just a couple of administrative things. We are quickly closing in on 9,000 downloads since we started in January. And I just, again, want to extend my gratitude for everyone who has joined us in the Inflammation Nation and is enjoying the podcast and supporting us. Another way you can support the podcast and the efforts that I put into this is by subscribing either on Apple Podcast or on Spotify. Those are the two main platforms. You can find us on any of the common podcast platforms, but those are probably the two big ones. You can rate, you can review, of course you can like and follow, and that would be a great way that doesn't cost you anything, that supports the kind of work that we're doing here with the Inflammation Nation. All right, so let's move on. We spent some time talking about guiding principles last time, and I think I mentioned that I was going to move on to the actual 5 pillars, and I hate to tell you, I lied, not intentionally. I think there's a couple more things that we want to talk about in dealing with very common questions that we get as it relates to hormone approaches. And I think we should talk about those before we actually get into the 5 pillars. And I really didn't mean to mislead you. So if you're expecting the 5-pillar discussion today, it's going to be in a different episode. I want to kind of backtrack just a little bit and just talk about the hormones that we're talking about, because we've spent a lot of time talking about cortisol. We spent some time talking about insulin. We talked about thyroid over 1 or 2 different episodes. But let's be clear about the reproductive hormones, or what commonly called gender hormones. And just to kind of give you a very quick list and a couple of tidbits about each of these different aspects. There's one progesterone, there are 3 types of estrogens, and there are 3 types of androgens. And androgens refer to, male type hormones like testosterone. And within the estrogens, and we can actually rank these hormones that have different versions, like the estrogens and the androgens, we can rank them in order of metabolic impact, like the most powerful to the least powerful, or we could go least powerful to most powerful. And so within the group of estrogens, we have E1, E2, and E3, as they're commonly referred to in the literature. And E1 is estrone, E2 is estradiol, and E3 is estriol or estriol. And of those 3, the most powerful is estradiol or E2. And that's the one that is dominant in a woman's reproductive years. It's the one that has the greatest physiological impact, both in men and in women. And that's followed in terms of metabolic impact by E1 or estrone. And then the least impactful, the least powerful, if you will, of the estrogens is E3 or estriol, which is absent in a woman of reproductive years unless she's pregnant. But interestingly enough, in postmenopausal years, as long as she's not on hormone replacement therapy, estriol or E3 becomes the dominant hormone. Now, in men, we see estrogen as well. And I had mentioned before that we commonly refer to these as gender hormones, or female hormones and male hormones, which is a little bit of a misnomer. But I think we all understand why we do that, just simply because estrogens are dominant in females and testosterone or androgens are dominant in males. But nevertheless, men have estrogen, women have androgens. Obviously, they have them in different proportions. And in many cases, we manufacture them in different ways. So in men, estrogen is made in small amounts by the adrenals. and predominantly from the conversion of androgens into estrogens. And we can see conversion of, we'll talk about the androgen types in just a second, but we can see conversion into different types of estrogens, and it's governed by a hormone called aromatase. And aromatase and the process of aromatization is natural. All men do it, but some men do it to a greater degree than others, and we would call those men aromatizers. But even women aromatize. So women have an enzyme called aromatase, which also takes androgens and converts it into estrogen. And this is actually one of the main ways that women who are in that peri and postmenopausal status maintain their estrogen drive or their estrogen sufficiency. And if you think of it this way, once a woman goes through the transition, or maybe gets a hysterectomy, for example, the only way that she really makes any appreciable amount of estrogen is by taking androgens that she's producing mostly from her adrenal system and then converting that through aromatization into estrogens. And in the postmenopausal woman, if that system works very well, she may not need hormone replacement. Some women will, based on some of the principles that we talked about in the last episode. So there's one estrogen and there's one progesterone and 3 estrogens. Now, of course, there are metabolites of each of these. I don't think we're going to get into that type of granular detail. I want to try to keep this as top level as possible because the information I'm sharing is going to give you a framework of understanding that, later details might, if we get into that, will make a lot more sense. But again, these 3 estrogens, E1, E2, and E3, can be ranked according to metabolic impact, with estradiol or E2 being the most powerful one, both for men and for women. Now, the 3 androgens are, and this actually is in order of metabolic impact from the least to the most. The least metabolically impactful or powerful androgen is called androstenedione. And this is made as a result of adrenal action. In fact, when we do salivary testing for, say, adrenal circadian rhythms, we quite often will add on a hormonal assessment. And if we see a low androstenedione, it's almost always because we have some kind of adrenal dysfunction, simply because the precursor to that comes out of the adrenals, the DHEA hormone. Pardon me. And so androstenedione is the least powerful, followed by testosterone, which is, I guess, kind of like the gold standard in terms of comparing the relative strength of these different androgens. And the most powerful one is called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And these 3 different androgens interconvert between each other. So, for example, androstenedione can convert enzymatically and become testosterone, and vice versa. You can go the other direction. Testosterone can convert into dihydrotestosterone, again, through enzymatic action. And these enzymes can be either inhibited or activated by different changes in the metabolic environment. And so we may, for example, give testosterone in hormone replacement strategy to one man who may not necessarily convert it into other things, whereas someone else might hyperconvert testosterone into dihydrotestosterone or into estrogen through that aromatization process. And so we can't always predict exactly how the hormone terrain is going to change when we engage in hormone replacement therapy, which is one of the reasons why I like to be a little bit more conservative and cautious until we understand what that bigger picture means. I don't think it's appropriate in most cases to put someone on hormone replacement just because they're in your office and that's what you do, without doing some kind of a responsible assessment of not just their general metabolic terrain, but more specifically, what's going on with the 5 pillars, which we'll get to again in a different episode. And I promise we will get there. And so with these 3 androgens, androstenedione, testosterone, and the dihydrotestosterone, again, those are ranked in order of potency. One of the things to understand about androstenedione is that while it is a relatively weaker androgen, it has a very high binding affinity for testosterone receptors, which means if you have some kind of a stress reaction and your androstenedione levels are really high and you're not converting that into testosterone well, the excess androstenedione can actually bind to your testosterone receptors and prevent testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, the more powerful androgens, from docking with the receptors and having a metabolic impact. To translate that into more simple terms, because of stress chemistry, we can convert male hormones into a weak type and prevent the more powerful androgens from having their metabolic impact. And so you have plenty of hormones there. You just can't access function because it changes receptor site activity or receptor site activation. On the flip side, dihydrotestosterone is, depending on which resource you read, up to, let's say, about 10 times more powerful than testosterone is. And one of the dangers of having somebody convert more testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, this is true of both men and women, is that what ends up happening is because that hormone is so powerful, it's very easy to overwhelm the receptor system. And we can actually create androgen resistance patterns in much the same way that we can have something like insulin resistance, where with insulin resistance, you have too much insulin, the receptors don't work anymore, so the body tries to make more insulin to get it to respond. With dihydrotestosterone, if we have more of that, we get such a powerful androgenic effect that the system tries to protect itself by downregulating the receptors. And so you can see that with all these different interconnections between the different androgens and between androgens and estrogens through these converting type enzymes, that it's very easy for something to shift and change, which can have a great metabolic impact on both male and female physiology. So obviously with men, these androgens are made predominantly through testicular activation. If you remember, signals come from the brain, from the hypothalamus and pituitary. These are hormonal signals that then tell the tissue in the testicles or in the ovaries for women to make certain hormones. And what ends up with in women, these androgens, as I mentioned just a moment ago, are made predominantly by the adrenals, and then they get converted into estrogens in the postmenopausal female. But in the cycling female, what happens quite often with this male hormone part of their hormonal profile is that they end up over-converting testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, and that happens in the context of stress chemistry as well as progesterone insufficiency. And the DHT levels basically can drive things like hair loss and hair growth on the face, or what we call hirsutism. This is very common in hyperglycemic states, insulin resistance, prediabetes, or what we would otherwise call metabolic syndrome, which is the main cause of something like PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so whether you're looking at the classically classified female hormones or the classically categorized male type hormones, and whether you're looking at a man or a woman, there is a lot that can change in other outside influencing factors that determine ultimately whether or not your hormones are in balance, or if something has shifted out of balance and you're either getting weak hormone responses or too strong hormone responses, and you end up with function that goes wrong. And so ultimately at the end of the day, and this is just repeating one of our guiding principles, is that hormone imbalances and the symptoms that come from that are always, always, always secondary to something else. And so instead of just jumping into hormone replacement, whether that's in the peri or postmenopausal state, or a man going through andropause, or what we jokingly call menopause, or if it's a woman in her reproductive years that just has a lot of PMS symptoms and opts to use birth control pill to kind of even the symptoms out, not necessarily for contraception, there's a lot that can go wrong that dysregulates these hormones, and jumping into hormone replacement as a knee-jerk reaction or to simply create symptom resolution really ignores the underlying root cause. And there's always a consequence for that. It may take time for that to manifest, but there's always a consequence. So that's just kind of a general overview of the terrain of the different types of hormones. Remember, 1 progesterone, 3 different estrogens, 3 different androgens. Men and women have all of it. It's just about relative proportions, balance, as well as understanding that there are certain other systems that underlie hormone imbalance and control, and that is a topic for a different episode. So that's one of the main questions that we get, which is, what are these hormones and how do they all relate to each other? The second question that we get quite often is about bioidentical versus synthetic hormones. And in the world of conventional and natural medicine, you typically have 2 camps that are very, very polarized. One is very in favor of using synthetic hormones, and the other is very in favor of bioidentical. And obviously you have people who kind of in between, and you have a lot of conventionally trained but integrative type medical doctors and nurse practitioners that prefer to use bioidenticals, even though they've been classically trained to think synthetic first. And they do have some people who are in the integrative alternative space that might look at the synthetics and go, okay, well, we would tend to prefer natural things, but in some cases, synthetics might work okay. We see that certainly in the field of thyroid hormone replacement therapy, and we can see it to a certain extent as well in terms of reproductive hormones. Now, this is just my opinion, and please remember that I'm not a prescribing physician, so I do not have the scope of practice to prescribe hormones or change hormone prescriptions that are given to my clients from other people. My job is to educate my clients about hormonal systems and what might be going on in their bodies to change how those hormones are balanced or how they're working or how they're not working, and then have them go back and have intelligent discussions with people who are controlling that prescription side of things. But nevertheless, one of the questions comes on, and it's usually with people who are either on synthetic hormones and they're thinking about switching to bioidentical because they believe that it's a better option for them. Hi there, it's Dr. Noseworthy. I want to extend my appreciation to all of you in the Inflammation Nation who have helped my podcast become a great success in these first few months. I truly appreciate you. Also wanted to let you know about my brand new do-it-yourself online program called the 5-Step Gut Protocol. I designed this program for people who want to take charge of their own health and stop waiting around for someone else to tell them what to do. I've combined old naturopathic principles with cutting-edge research to create a truly unique program that will help you construct your own gut protocol. If you've ever wondered if you have gut infections, a leaky gut, or a bad microbiome, then this program will walk you through the steps to figure that out and gives you the tools that you need to formulate a practical strategy to help make things better. I guarantee at the end of this course you'll know more about your gut than your doctor does, and you will feel confident that you know how to address your unique situation. You can check it out at my website at www.drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com. And just look for the tab at the top that says The Programs. Thanks for listening. Or maybe it's somebody who they're not on hormones yet, but they're thinking about seeing someone about hormones, but they're not sure if they should go to see someone for bioidentical compounded type hormones or if they should just go conventional and just engage in the whole synthetic thing. So there's a couple of things to know about in terms of, first of all, how about efficacy? Whether a hormone is synthetic or it's bioidentical, the impact in terms of creating a certain type of function is going to be the same whether or not you're looking at synthetic versus bioidentical hormones. Because whether it's synthetic or bioidentical, the hormone structure is such that it can bind to receptors and it can create the type of response that we're looking for. The problem comes in the potential side effects. And that's I think, where we can start to make some fairly definitive statements about what is better, what is worse, and if there is a con, what is the con? So I want to talk just very briefly about a couple of studies that were done, and I'm going back many, many years, and I probably should have looked up the year that the Women's Health Initiative was started, but I remember this was before I actually got into functional medicine, and I was practicing as a brain-based spinal stability structural chiropractor. And what ended up happening was this study called the Women's Health Initiative was a 5-year study where they were looking at the impact of synthetic progestins as well as synthetic estrogens and combinations of those things, either by themselves or in combination, on the impact of hormones in women's health. And it was a 5-year study, and after 3 years, the ethics committee had to stop the study because women were dying of clots and heart attacks and embolic events and all this kind of stuff. And this is what triggered a massive exodus, if you will, away from synthetics into bioidentical hormones. That somewhat since is kind of course corrected. I think the conventional docs initially got a little bit scared, but over time they kind of went back and just did what they're used to doing. But nevertheless, this is kind of like a black mark in the history of synthetic hormones, in the sense that certain synthetic hormone combinations in particular, synthetic estrogen and synthetic progestins, which are, it's not the same as progesterone, it's a progestin and it is a synthetic compound. Those two things together dramatically increase the risk that a woman taking those hormones is going to suffer some kind of clotting event, thromboembolism, deep vein problems, all these kind of things. And so if there is one thing that we can say fairly definitively is that if you're going to go synthetic, don't use that combination. You don't want something that's a combination of synthetic estrogens and synthetic progestins. We're talking about Premarin and Provera mostly, because those are the ones that in that study had the highest probability of causing thromboembolisms and other types of issues that lead up to women dying. There was also a British study called the Million Woman Study that was, I believe, around the same time. It might have been just a couple of years later that found several things. Now, that doesn't mean that synthetic estrogens by themselves or synthetic progestins by themselves aren't okay. I also can't say that they're entirely risk-free. But I would say as a general rule, all other things being equal, bioidentical hormones have a better safety profile than synthetic hormones. But a lot of this is going to depend on other factors, like the major metabolic terrain of the people who are taking these hormones. So there are some women out there, perhaps many, who can take synthetic hormones, perhaps even that combination of synthetic estrogen and progestins, take them for years and years and years and years and never actually have a thrombotic event, never have actually an increased risk of mortality. Are there women who can have negative consequences of using bioidentical hormones? Absolutely. Not to the same extent typically that you're going to see with, say, the results of the Women's Health Initiative. So I think as a general rule, and I'm just offering my opinion here, if someone in my family came to consult with me and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing reproductive hormone replacement therapy, should I go bioidentical or should I go synthetic? I would tend to recommend to them that they talk to somebody about bioidentical hormones before they even think about the synthetic ones. And again, that's a general rule. It is my opinion, and I believe that we have some good research to back up those different statements. So I'm going to keep going. Today's going to be just a little bit longer because I've got a couple of other things to cover. One more thing actually to cover before we start getting into the 5 pillars. Actually, 2. I keep flip-flopping. And the next thing is, let's talk about delivery methods. If we can kind of accept a general statement or a statement as being generally true, that for the most part and for most women, bioidentical hormones are going to be safer in general than synthetic hormones. The next thing that we might want to talk about is the delivery method. And that's another common question that I get for clients who are either on or are using it, or sometimes we do our own hormonal assessment and I might make a recommendation that they go back to their prescribing doctor and talk to them about actually taking the hormone in a different method, because hormones can be delivered different ways. They can be delivered in pill form. Usually it's a micronized oil, or they can be delivered as a sublingual, either as a liquid or as like a lozenge. The word would be troche or troche, depending on if you're American or British. You can deliver hormones in cream form or topical form. You can do injections, or you can have pellets implanted in your gluteus maximus. And each of these different delivery methods have pros and cons. And of course, I tend to have my favorite for a couple of different reasons, which we'll explore as we keep going through. But let me just talk very briefly about the pros and cons of these different delivery methods. And what I'm trying to do then is I'm trying to kind of lay out a series of questions in a hierarchical manner that we would like to answer questions first before we make a commitment in one direction versus another. And so the first question is, do I really need it? The big discussion on that is going to be about the 5 pillars. The second question is, if I'm going to pursue this, should I go synthetic or bioidentical? And then the next question is going to be, how do I deliver it to my body? So let's talk about pills. This is one of the more common forms. One of the pros is just it's easy to take. Usually it's a single dose. For the most part, you can have a compounding pharmacy make any combination of hormones in any dosing combination that a doctor deems as necessary or appropriate. But the problem, and this is probably the main difficulty with oral type hormones, is that when you swallow a capsule with a hormone in it, the first place it goes, that as it breaks down and gets absorbed, first place it goes is to the liver, where there are biotransformation enzymes that immediately bind a large portion of these hormones, which are delivered typically in the free fraction, free being not bound to anything else and biologically available. So the first thing that happens when you swallow it is it goes to the liver, and the liver takes all these free fractions and says, hey, this is the innate intelligence of the body, says, hey, it's not good to have such a large influx of free fraction hormones that are biologically available. Let me attach these binding proteins to them so that they can safely circulate. Now, ultimately, the estimate is about only 10% of a hormone that you swallow orally in pill form actually gets delivered to your tissues in free fraction. The rest of it gets either bound to a carrier protein, or it gets transformed by the liver pretty much immediately into some kind of a secondary, sometimes even a tertiary metabolite. So a very small fraction of what you take. And that means with oral dosing, your dosing has to be higher to get to the impact that you're looking for at the cellular level. Nevertheless, a lot of women do very well in pill with hormones in pill form. The next option is sublingual, and there's a couple of different options. There are sublingual liquids, which tend to be very low dose bioidentical natural source hormones. And then there are these lozenges or troches or troches, which are designed to just sit between your cheek and your gum and just dissolve over a period of time. And some of it gets absorbed in the buccal mucosa of your mouth, and some of it, of course, you're going to swallow. So with these lozenges or these troches, you're going to get a mixture of hormones that are swallowed, go to the liver, and that actually get transformed and bound to carrier proteins right away. But you're also going to have some of those that are absorbed through the lining of your mouth, and they will actually avoid that, what's called the first pass liver metabolism, and will deliver a higher amount of hormones in the free fraction, which is ideally what you want. And because it dissolves over a period of time, you're going to get kind of a slow input or a slower introduction of hormones. What we want to avoid is a big, massive influx of free fraction hormones all at one time. The body will protect itself by doing one of two things. Either you're going to see the liver intervening and transforming those into metabolites or binding them with binding proteins, or you're going to see the cells starting to downregulate the receptors so they don't get overstimulated. That's the power of the innate intelligence of the human body. Now, I do like sublinguals, and in fact, I like sublinguals, and there are sublinguals that are available without prescription through different nutraceutical companies that use plant-based extracts that give us bioidentical forms of the low-impact estriol as well as progesterone. And because these are low-dose, low-impact hormones and they're absorbed sublingually, we can kind of get around a lot of the cons of other types of hormones and other types of hormonal introduction or delivery methods. The next one then would be creams or topicals. One of the big advantages of these is that we can easily deliver biologically active free fraction hormones. The downside of creams is that because it has to be absorbed transdermally or across the skin, if you're not careful about washing, anything that's on the skin will actually get brought into your body at the same time. So typically you want to wash an area that you're going to apply these topical creams to. But the con of the topicals and the creams is, number one, you typically have to do more frequent applications. So instead of, for example, swallowing a pill once a day, you might have to put a cream on twice a day. Not really a big deal, but some people don't like to have to do that. There's also the potential for cross-contamination with sexual partners. Depending on how careful you're being about what activities you engage in after you put that cream on your body. And I think you can probably guess what I'm talking about. Let's say that a woman is supposed to put on estrogen or progesterone cream at night, and she puts that on her arms or her legs and then slips into bed, and then she and her partner are intimate, And literally, because it takes an hour or so for that to be absorbed fully through the skin, within that period of time, if she has physical contact with a sexual partner, some of that can rub off into his skin, get absorbed into his body, and completely change his hormonal environment. And the reverse is true of men who are using topical testosterone. There has to be a period of time where you're like, okay, don't touch me because it might mess you up. And so that's something that has to be considered as well. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And then there are some people with topicals and with cream-based hormones that have a tendency to trap and hold on to these free fraction hormones in the subdermal layers. And that becomes an extra reservoir of hormones that ends up over a period of time leading into hormone overload. And this is probably the main reason why a lot of docs that prescribe hormones don't like cream applications, is because of the tendency of some people to get into hormone overload with the free fractions. That's not all that often. You can spot it readily if you're doing appropriate testing and monitoring people's levels. And of course, if you can change dosing parameters and how often and how frequently people put the creams on. I would tend to put sublinguals as my first option, and then creams properly applied, if you will, as my second option. And again, this is my opinion. That's all it is. The next delivery method, and there's only one more after this, the next one is injection. And, the con of that is, or the pro of the injection, to be honest, I don't know there's many pros. Again, my opinion. The con is, number one, it's literally a pain in the butt. You've got to inject these into your glutes or have somebody else do it for you, typically on a weekly basis. The problem with injections is that what ends up happening generally is you end up with a surge of hormone levels followed by a relatively rapid and not symmetrical decline over the next period, several days to a week. And what ends up happening is that it's very important to time your second injection, your third injection, your fourth injection over a period of days to prevent your hormones from skyrocketing in a short period of time and then tanking, and then skyrocketing and then tanking. What we want with hormones, for the most part, is consistent and stable levels. And this is where pellets came in. And that's the final delivery method, is to have a pellet that is designed to dissolve slowly over a period of time, actually implanted subdermally again, typically in your hip area. And some people really like this. And to be honest, I think a lot of it has to do with not necessarily how these pellets are formulated to be slow release to avoid those highs and lows that you might see, say, with an injection. But depending on the physiology of the person and how quickly their body starts to break down whatever protective coating allows it to be a slow release capsule or pellet, some women and some men will have different hormone release timings. That's not the right word, but different hormone release parameters, where some people might release more slowly than intended, and so their hormones are lower than what we might expect. And some will actually release faster, and we'll kind of get that surge and that tank that we might see with an injection. Nevertheless, there are a lot of men and women that do well with injections. They do well with pellets. There's a huge amount of variability. And really what you kind of have to do is you have to weigh the pros and cons, even as it relates to things like convenience, the potential for cross-contamination. Do I need a low, slow input, or do I need something really strong and really fast? Do I want to do something once a day, twice a day, once a week? Am I okay injecting a needle? Does it make sense to me to have a pellet implanted in my buttocks? All of these are questions that are, I think, clinically relevant, and the answers to these are going to be highly individual. The problem is that typically it's the clinician's choice, because generally when you see hormone replacement strategies, a clinician is going to choose the methodology that they like, the one that makes sense to them based on their reading of literature, or maybe it's as a result of their experience in dealing with clients with hormonal issues in the past. Either way, what I said just a moment ago is what I wanted to do is kind of introduce to you a series of questions that we can ask and answer in a hierarchical process, sequence is the word I was looking for, so that we can make sure that we're actually thinking through the problem and arriving at a mixture of hormone types, delivery methods that make sense for you as an individual person. And unfortunately, a lot of clinicians get locked into one way of doing things. I always do synthetics through injection, or I do synthetics through pellets, or I only do topical cream-based compounded bioidenticals. And maybe those are right for you, maybe not. But at least now you have a methodology and some questions and some potential answers that you can start thinking this through, so you can have an intelligent conversation with your prescribing doctors. Now, on the next episode, what we're going to talk about is different hormone testing strategies. And I promise once we put that to rest, we'll move on and we'll talk about the 5 pillars specifically. Hey, thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.